Imagine waking up to no electricity, no fuel for cooking, no buses running, hospitals canceling surgeries, and garbage piling up in the streets. This is not a scene from a post-apocalyptic film, but the harsh unfolding reality for over 11 million people living in Cuba right now, and the situation is getting worse by the day. So stay with us, because what we are about to share might be one of the most important geopolitical stories you will follow in 2026. And if you find this content eye-opening, please hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss a critical update like this one. Cuba is currently trapped in a devastating oil shock that traces us directly back to the United States, seizing Venezuelan oil tankers in December 2025, as part of a broader escalation that effectively ended Venezuela's ability to deliver crude to the island, cutting off what had long been Cuba's most important and politically subsidized energy lifeline. And this was not a sudden, isolated act, but the latest chapter in a decades-long conflict rooted in Cold War politics, ideology, and the fundamental question of whether a socialist state can survive in America's hemisphere in the 21st century without facing existential economic pressure from Washington. Between January and October 2025, Cuba's oil and derivative imports had already declined by a staggering 35% compared to the same period in 2024, with the island importing approximately 45,400 barrels per day of crude oil, liquefied gas, and other fuels compared to 69,400 barrels per day the year before, a drop of more than 24,000 barrels per day that directly undermined the country's ability to sustain even its most basic energy infrastructure and left millions of ordinary citizens increasingly unable to access reliable electricity, transportation, or clean water. Cuba's aging thermal power plants, which form the backbone of the national grid and almost all of which run on crude oil or fuel oil, have been deteriorating for years due to inadequate investment, substandard fuel, and deferred maintenance. While from 2010 to 2024, the Cuban government spent approximately 32% of total investment on tourism-related infrastructure and only 12% on energy infrastructure, according to Cuba's own National Statistics Office, revealing a long-standing structural imbalance that has left the country dangerously unprepared for the current crisis. On January 29, 2026, United States President Donald Trump signed Executive Order 14,380, which entered into force the following day and declared a national emergency in the United States, authorizing the imposition of additional tariffs on imports from any country that directly or indirectly supplies oil to Cuba, a move widely described as the first effective blockade of Cuba since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, sending immediate shockwaves through every nation that had until then continued to quietly supply the island with the fuel it desperately needed. Mexico, which had until recently supplied approximately 44% of Cuba's total oil imports, temporarily halted those shipments by January 27, 2026. With Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum framing the pause as a sovereign decision, though it came unmistakably in response to Trump's tariff threats against any nation that continued to deliver energy resources to the besieged Caribbean island, effectively depriving Cuba of nearly half of its remaining fuel supply at the worst possible moment in the ongoing energy emergency. The Cuban Aviation Corporation confirmed that it would suspend refueling services for aircraft for an entire month due to the acute shortage, prompting multiple international airlines to warn passengers and eventually suspend flights to Cuba altogether, while reports confirmed that ordinary Cubans are now turning to charcoal for cooking and purchasing expensive solar panels for electricity as the government reduces office hours, restricts fuel sales nationwide, and struggles to maintain any semblance of normal daily operations across an increasingly desperate population. Cuban authorities formally acknowledged an acute fuel shortage and announced emergency measures that have dramatically reshaped daily life across the island, including strict limits on fuel sales to the public, a 4-day workweek for many state entities, shorter school hours, and reduced university attendance requirements, and significant cutbacks to interprovincial bus and train services that millions of Cubans rely on every single day just to get to work, visit family, or access medical facilities that are themselves now severely compromised. Hospitals across the island are now prioritizing only the most urgent medical procedures as the government rations whatever fuel remains, while garbage collection in Havana has effectively broken down because fuel shortages have sidelined collection trucks. With only 44 of Havana's 106 rubbish vehicles, roughly 41.5% of the fleet, still able to operate, leaving mountains of waste accumulating on street corners across the capital and creating a growing secondary public health crisis on top of the already catastrophic energy emergency gripping the nation. Households are simultaneously experiencing water shortages because pumps require electricity to function. Refrigeration has become unreliable across the country, threatening both food and medicine storage. And even the tourism industry, one of Cuba's key remaining sources of hard currency, is struggling as hotels and restaurants attempt to maintain services amid rolling power outages that can stretch well beyond 12 hours in some regions. Further hollowing out the foreign revenue streams, Cuba most urgently needs to purchase fuel on international markets. Analysts draw uncomfortable comparisons between the current crisis and Cuba's special period of the early 1990s, when the collapse of the Soviet Union triggered severe shortages, and Cuba's GDP fell by roughly a third between 1991 and 1994. Though experts note that today's crisis may feel even more severe because Cuba never fully recovered from that earlier collapse and is now starting this new nosedive. From a position already deep in economic distress, with far fewer international allies willing or able to step in and provide meaningful emergency assistance. The United Nations Human Rights Office has warned that the blockade and the resulting fuel shortage are threatening Cuba's food supply and disrupting water systems and hospital operations, while UN Secretary-General spokespeople cautioned that a humanitarian collapse is possible if Cuba's energy needs are not urgently addressed. And cumulative economic damage to Cuba from the American embargo now exceeds $170 billion at current prices, making it one of the most prolonged and costly economic sieges in modern international history. Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel stated that U.S. sanctions cost Cuba over $7.5 billion between March 2024 and February 2025 alone, and called the Trump administration's energy blockade a form of psychological war, while analysts warned that the intense external pressure is also paradoxically fueling Cuban nationalism and anti-American sentiment, making regime change through economic strangulation a far more complicated and uncertain goal than Washington may have anticipated when it moved so aggressively to cut off the island's remaining fuel supply. President Trump told reporters on January 31, 2026, that the situation does not have to be a humanitarian crisis, and suggested Cuba should make a deal with Washington to end the fuel squeeze, though he offered no specific clarity on what such a deal would entail. While Cuba's President Díaz-Canel insisted his government is prepared to hold dialogue with the United States, but only under conditions of mutual respect, not under the coercive pressure of an oil blockade that is visibly destroying the livelihoods of millions of innocent civilians. Cuba has set an ambitious goal of deriving 37% of its energy from renewable sources by 2030, but so far has reached only 3% of that target. And while agreements with Russia focus on modernizing existing thermal facilities, financial constraints and inadequate planning continue to block the large-scale renewable development that would be necessary to meaningfully reduce the island's catastrophic dependence on imported fossil fuels, leaving Cuba fundamentally vulnerable to exactly the kind of external energy shock it is currently enduring with no swift resolution in sight. Cuba stands at a historic crossroads, one that will determine whether its government survives, whether its people endure even deeper suffering, and whether the international community ultimately allows economic blockades to reshape sovereign nations by force. And we want to know what you think. Is the United States justified in using oil as a weapon to pursue regime change in Cuba? Or does this cross a line into collective punishment of an entire civilian population? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Share this video with someone who needs to understand this crisis. And if you have not already, please subscribe to our channel right now so you stay informed as this rapidly evolving story continues to unfold.